Good morning, everyone, or perhaps good afternoon even, if you're joining us from other parts of Australia. My name's Tim Bray. I'm Assistant Coordinator of Energy here at Energy Policy WA, and I'm joined online by our team, and in particular by Sarah and Aurelie, who will be playing a key role in presenting today. May I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which we meet. As you see in that beautiful image there of the Derbarl Yerrigan or the Swan River, we're here in Perth or Noongar Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and present, and equally pay our respects to elders past and present from wherever it is that you may be joining us today, and want to acknowledge any Aboriginal people who are joining us here today. We have a really interesting session lined up for you today, and we're so glad that you're able to join us for it. The key here that I guess I want to emphasise before handing over to the team is that we're talking about the future of the way in which regulations may apply to on-site power supply arrangements, or OPSA, as we've called them for short. And although OPSA is a term that's not limited to solar PV, as a reasonable proxy, you can think of solar as a service in terms of shorthand for what we're talking about. But don't worry, the team will elaborate on that throughout the session so that you can understand in some detail what it is that we mean when we say OPSA. And I guess the reason why we're thinking about these things is because it won't be a surprise to you that we know that the electricity sector is changing, and the ways, particularly in which consumers receive, use and manage their electricity is changing too, at a rapid pace. And so new services are emerging, just like solar as a service. And as a result, we need to think about the ways in which our regulation and our policy settings evolve to deal with business models that are atypical and are becoming more common. So these changes are not a bad thing, they're a good thing. And very often they complement the energy transition as we move towards a more sustainable grid, and can help, in fact, drive investment in sustainable energy infrastructure. So these models are, please don't interpret us as thinking that they're not good. But what we do want to do is ensure that we understand what it is that they do, how they work, and that we make sure that energy consumers are, of course, front and centre in terms of keeping pace with how these things work, and that their interests are en masse looked after. But we want to find the right balance. And so a session like today and the information we're providing is very much provided in the sense of help us find the balance. We want your views, we need your views in order to make sure that we either aren't too light touch or too heavy-handed. And so as a result of that, we've launched the Sharing the Power campaign that happened on the 22nd of February. And sharing the balance is just about what I said. It's about finding the best way to extend customer protections to these new and emerging business models without going too far and encumbering those business models unnecessarily. So we know that existing regulatory frameworks aren't always flexible enough or fit for purpose, and so we need to modernise too. That's really what we're about here. And so with that in mind, we've been developing a new framework, the Alternative Electricity Services, or AES framework, and it's designed to be more flexible in regulating these kind of services. And so this whole process is about seeking feedback from stakeholders about the best way to extend standard electricity protections to new OPSA customers. We're considering all regulatory options available. We don't have set views, but we have put things out there that are designed to elicit your feedback. That's exactly what this is about. And again, I'll repeat, designed to try and find a good balance between ensuring customer rights and keeping the relative regulatory burden low. So as we move in, we have an agenda, and we have two key presenters who are leading this work here, who are very, very qualified and informed in order to support us through this conversation. First is Sarah, who is the Assistant Director of Customer Supply. And so she'll start by giving us some more context on the regulatory options and a brief project update. And then Aurelie, who's the Principal Policy Analyst in Sarah's team, will discuss the current consultation process, focused on the regulation of OPSA, and Aurelie will also give a brief overview of the draft code obligations for OPSA services. We think that we've designed the session in a way that should allow plenty of time to take questions. But on that, because this is a large online forum, we've set up the Q&A function. So please use that. That's the way of getting your question addressed and answered, and we'll make sure that we get through absolutely as many as we can, hopefully all of them, as we go through. You can also vote for questions. So if you see someone else put a question in that you like, put the thumb up on it and that'll put it forward. Please also note that we're recording this session to make sure that we capture everything. And with that, I think it's probably time for me to hand over to Sarah. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. All right, so I'll give a quick overview of the project so far and our timeframes. So just as some context, Tim's kind of already touched on this, but the context of why we're doing this, it's about making sure we give electricity customers electricity rights. We know most electricity customers have electricity rights, but we think most is not good enough. So at the moment, we have two options. We have licensing and we have exemptions. On the left there, you can see licensing in the green bubble. Customers of licensed providers have a full suite of customer protections available to them. They have a robust compliance and enforcement framework overseen by the Economic Regulation Authority, or the ERA. And customers have access to the Energy and Water Ombudsman if they have a dispute they need help with. For those for whom licensing is not fit for purpose, at the moment, the only option is the exemption framework on the right there. So customers of exempt providers have very few customer protections. We can put some in place through conditions of exemption, but there's a very poor compliance and enforcement framework associated with that. Essentially, if someone isn't complying with a condition of their exemption, the exemption falls away and they have no legal authority to do what they're currently doing in terms of providing that service. Also, customers have no access to the Ombudsman, and there's no real way to give customers Ombudsman access under the exemption framework. So we thought we needed a middle ground here, something that was a bit lighter handed and a bit more fit for purpose for the smaller providers and the new and emerging business models. And so that's that blue circle in the middle, the AES framework. And the way the AES framework would work is, as services are brought under that framework, the providers of those services would need to register. They need to register with the ERA again. There would be a light-handed compliance and enforcement framework overseen by the ERA. And we could put in place tailored and appropriate levels of customer protections for whatever that service is to give customers the protections they need. We can also give customers access to the Ombudsman to assist with any disputes. Next slide, please, Aurelie. So what does this look like in practice? We want to be flexible and we want to be able to apply it to a whole range of different services. The primary legislation will need to change. So the Electricity Industry Act is where the licensing and exemption framework sits. We're currently in the process of amending that to establish the AES framework alongside those. The legislation to do that is in Parliament. It passed the Legislative Assembly in November last year, and we're looking for it to go through the Legislative Council, hopefully by mid this year. Once that framework is in place, we will then have the power to regulate services under it. And for each service we want to regulate, we'll go through a regulatory impact assessment, as we are now with OPSA, to test that this is the right form of regulation for that service. To regulate them, we'd make regulations under the framework to prescribe that service. And we'd also make protections in an AES code of practice, which would set out the detailed customer protection obligations applying to customers of that service. So for providers of that service, they would need to register with the ERA, they'd need to sign up to the Electricity Ombudsman scheme, and they would have to comply with those conditions of registration, the main one being the code of practice. Next slide, please. So how is this tracking and where are we up to? So first of all, I'll note that the timeframes here are not on a linear scale. There's a bit more sort of crabbed in the early half, and so the timeframes are a bit more spread out there. And these dates are subject to change because they are dependent on some things outside of our control. For instance, the passage of the legislation through Parliament is subject to other parliamentary priorities. But what we're hoping for is that the AES framework, those kind of legislative heads of power, will be through Parliament by mid this year. We have the consultation processes that we're currently undertaking for OPSA, and we also are doing the same for embedded networks. So there's another paper about that, and you may have seen the forum on Tuesday about that. We're also consulting on general settings for regulations about how the AES framework will work. And we've got a consultation paper about those general regulatory settings. We've got a forum about that topic on Monday next week. Once we have the input from all those consultations, we will then be looking to get a final government decision about those first two services that we're looking to potentially regulate under the AES framework. We will be looking to make regulations and the initial AES code of practice and the general regulations by the end of this calendar year if we can, so that there's lots of time for people to get ready. We'll then have about 6 months for the ERA and the Ombudsman to finalise their preparations in terms of having everything ready to accept members. And then we're aiming for about 6 months for a registration period for providers to sign up with those organisations before the compliance obligations take effect, hopefully on 1 January 2026 is our target. And so if we can meet that time frame, that means we should have a very clear picture of what the regulatory obligations are going to be a full year before they come into effect for providers. I will now hand over to Aurelie to talk a bit more detail about OPSA and the process we're going through for consultation. Thanks, Aurelie.
Thanks, Sarah, for providing that overview. Okay, let's start with what do we mean by OPSA. Tim did provide a little bit of an overview of that, but I want to just really be giving you a detailed description of it. So the main form of technology used in this arrangement currently is solar and/or battery. So we do sometimes use solar as a service, it's a shorthand, but the definition of OPSA isn't actually for any specific type of technology, and it is designed to capture future technologies that may be cropping up in the similar arrangements. An OPSA describes any arrangement where a customer is entitled to use some or all of the electricity produced by a system on their property, so behind the master meter, but they don't own the system. The system is maintained and owned by an OPSA provider. Ownership can be transferred to the customer at the end of the contract term. Sometimes that involves a small transfer fee or a payout figure. And payment mechanisms for an OPSA during the contract term vary from paying cents per kilowatt hour, like a solar power purchase agreement, or SPPA for short, or paying a subscription or membership. The subscription or membership can be for a related service, and the entitlement for the customer to use the electricity can be part of that service. I want to make clear that the service isn't any arrangement with an Australian financial service license or Australian credit license, so it's not a loan and it's not part of a tenancy agreement. So if you're living in a property and the landowner has solar, that's not usually an OPSA. OPSA customers can rely heavily on the system to manage their electricity costs, and the arrangements can be very long-term. They can be up to 10-year contracts with a substantial financial commitment or expensive exit penalties. This forum provides a snapshot of the consultation process we are running, known as the Consultation Regulatory Impact Statement. I'm just going to use the acronym CRIS because that's really a mouthful and I don't think I could be continuing to use that term. I really do hope you will participate in this stakeholder consultation process because we will really weigh up your feedback and for the different costs and benefits for the 4 options that could be considered for regulating the service in the future. But when you are giving us feedback, I would like to keep the objective of the consultation process in mind. So we want to find the best way, like Tim has said, find the right balance to give OPSA customers that use less than 160 megawatt hours per year. So that's a small use customer, quite technical, but it's important to note. So we want to give these customers electricity rights, including access to the Ombudsman, but without imposing unnecessary burden to the OPSA providers or any sort of barriers to the operating model. Okay, so which form of regulation and what are the 4 options? So you can only see 3 options on the slide because options 3 and 4 are variations of the AES framework option. And I will be providing a short snapshot of each of the 4 options in a few moments. Maintaining the status quo is the baseline for comparison, and there are a few issues. It would mean that different OPSA providers would continue to be regulated differently. So we've got some SPPAs, or solar power purchase arrangement providers, that are exempt currently from the licensing regime, and there's about 19. We've got new entrants that can only participate in the market if they become licensed, because the exemptions have been closed off to this operating model. And then there is the subscription and membership model, which currently appears to fall outside of the current framework. Because they're all dealt with differently, there are inequities between operators and customers. The status quo also doesn't provide OPSA customers with tailored customer protections or access to the Energy Ombudsman. Okay, option 2 requires all OPSA providers to be licensed and would provide the highest level of customer protections, but also the greatest costs for providers. The fact that for a few years now, exemptions have been closed to SPPA providers, but no SPPA provider has chosen to become licensed to enter the market, could be a very strong indication that licensing is actually a barrier for this operating model. Options 3 and 4 are variations of the AES. And as I said, I will be explaining them in a moment. But overall, the AES is anticipated to be cheaper, less onerous than licensing, but also at the same time providing consistent regulation and custom access to the Ombudsman. Okay, so we've got 2 options under the AES registration framework, but both of these options would see providers sign up to the ERA or register with the ERA and become a member of the Electricity Ombudsman Scheme. Under option 1, the AES code would require OPSA providers to sign up to the New Energy Technology Consumer Code, or NETCC for short. The NETCC is a voluntary code administered by the Clean Energy Council and approved by the ACCC. So it is designed to raise the standards of customer protections in this new energy tech sector and sets customer protection standards for the whole customer journey from marketing to system installation. The NETCC focuses on new energy technology as a product, not as an ongoing service. It means that it's not really specifically tailored to what we mean by OPSA, where the technology is not a direct sale, but instead the system continues to be owned by a third party and customers are entitled to use the electricity produced by the system. The NETCC doesn't cover any requirements around upfront information disclosure, billing, or financial hardship, because it is just about the purchase of the product. Under AES option 2, OPSA providers would need to adhere to bespoke obligations that would be outlined in the AES code. The customer protections would be less onerous than that for a licensed retailer and reflect that the OPSA customer continues to have a primary electricity supply with the electricity retailer and is therefore not reliant on the OPSA provider for electricity as an essential service. We have developed a draft set of obligations, and we are seeking feedback on these obligations to see whether we've reached the right balance. And again, I will be discussing them in more detail in a few moments. I'm sorry, I have now lost the ability to change slides. So there will be some, the consultation process also includes some general consultation questions and policy considerations. So we are asking questions about regulatory settings like application processes. For OPSA providers, do we want to do a comprehensive public consultation process, or are we allowing a fast track route, which is a little bit more streamlined, still has some criteria that needs to be met, but is a little bit faster. Then there are questions around requirements for licensed electricity retailers. So if someone already has a retail license and wants to provide an OPSA to customers, do we require them to have a license and be registered under the AES? Are we doing something with their license to make it a little bit more bespoke? That sort of question there. We're also considering transitional arrangements like what happens to SPPA providers if we are going to be registering under the AES registration framework. How do we transition them in the most efficient, the best way for SPPA providers, especially if there's system changes that will be a requirement. And then transitional arrangements for specific code obligations. So are there any specific code obligations, again, that require more comprehensive system changes? As promised, I'm going to now provide an overview of the draft code obligations under the AS code if the option were to be chosen for OPSA to be prescribed as an AES. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. It's just providing an overview of the types of obligations that could be in the AS code. But what I want to say on this, what I want to take a moment to say here is we are really open to feedback on each of these obligations, and we want to know whether we've struck the right balance. So I'm going to go clause by clause now, just to provide an overview of the clauses and some of the considerations that we would ask stakeholders to make when providing feedback. So clauses 2 and 3 set out the responsibility for marketing agents, and it makes the OPSA provider responsible for the marketing agents. It also is just sort of standard marketing practices, provide clear identification and clear contact details. Clause 4 is about the information provision, and particularly around the disclosure statement. At the moment, the draft code obligations are very heavy in the disclosure statement section. So we have a lot of obligations around disclosure and a lot of information that needs to be disclosed up front. And the question that we have for stakeholders is what part of it should sit in a contract and what part of it should stay in the disclosure statement, or do we want to have it all in the disclosure statement? And we're really seeking feedback here. Have we struck the right balance? Clause 7 is about information that must be on a bill. It's really just setting a standard of information for customers to verify what they're being charged for, particularly when it's on a cents per kilowatt basis, but also what their system is doing, how much they're producing, etc. Important to note that we understand that OPSA providers might not have billing practices at the moment. So we are allowing this information to be provided in an app under the current draft code obligations. The clause is really just about billing cycles, billing arrangements, pretty standard billing stuff. Now I'm going to go through a few clauses that are quite tricky to consider because grid connection is maintained, as I've said. So OPSA customers continue to have a relationship with their electricity retailer, and some of these provisions will be a double up between what the OPSA provider has to give the customer and what the retailer gives the customer. So financial hardship, family violence provision, and life support equipment are really prime examples of where do we strike the balance. I would like to say that the obligations that are currently in the draft code are pared back. For example, the life support equipment obligation is about having regard to the equipment or to our customer having life support equipment rather than having to comply with onerous obligations that the electricity retailer would need to comply with regarding continuity of supply. And again, clauses 11 and 12, consider them in mind with the grid connection being maintained because it's about disconnections, interruptions, and reconnections. So again, unless the disconnection to the OPSA system also includes a disconnection from the grid supply, the customer maintains supply. There's no interruption to their supply. So have we struck the right balance in these code obligations? Some of them are quite specific. You have to reconnect customers within 2 business days. You have to consider financial hardship before disconnecting the customer. You have to notify the customer a certain amount of time before disconnecting them. And again, it's just whether we've struck the right balance here. So, are the clauses going into too much detail given that the customer continues to have grid supply? Clause 13 is about access to the ombudsman and dispute resolution processes. I'm not going to spend too much time here because it's pretty straightforward and it's a very, very important part of the AS registration framework and a very important part of the objective is to provide customers with access to a really transparent dispute resolution process. But again, we're open to feedback here. So who should give feedback? anyone should give feedback. I invite you all to give me feedback, please. We would like to hear from you. If you are a customer or considering becoming a customer, if you're a provider or you want to enter the market, or if you're providing supporting services, like if you're helping with an OPSA provider install systems or maintain systems, feel free to review the consultation papers and everything that we have on Sharing the Power website to provide us with feedback. And feedback or possibility for feedback closes on the 19th of April at 5 p.m. You can go to Sharing the Power to read the consultation papers. They are quite long. And because we want to make it as easy as possible for stakeholders to provide feedback, please look at the supporting materials. There's short information papers that give you like a summary of the consultation papers. And there are response templates also available on the website. So it is designed to make it nice and easy. You can just throw us an email and provide feedback on the matters that really interest you or are relevant to you. What's going to happen now? So I'm going to start by saying that the AES framework will go ahead regardless of what we decide to do with OPSA, because the AES framework is designed to regulate emerging energy services that might only just crop up in the future. But after this consultation period, which again closes on the 19th of April, we will provide a decision regulatory impact statement. So a decision paper that essentially says, here's the feedback that we've received, here's how we've considered it, and this is our decision, and then this is the advice that has been provided to government. So there will be lots of opportunity to talk to us until the 19th of April. I'd love to hear from you. And thank you so very much for your time. Now we've come to the question part of the presentation.
I think you're on mute, Sarah.
Yeah. Thanks, Arlie. So we've come to the questions. We've got a few coming in already, but encourage you, if you have any questions, to pop them in the Q&A function, and we'll go through as many as we have time for. And if we get through them all and no one has any further questions, we may give you a bit more time back in your day. So we'll start with a couple from Liz Aiken. She's asked how the proposed framework applies to apps like WeVolt, where households are selling their electricity to EV owners or by renting an EV charger to charge their cars and earn money. And she also asked about VPPs, where customers own their own solar. So just to give you an idea of kind of how the framework will operate, the AES framework is very flexible to be able to apply to a whole range of different electricity related services. At the moment, we're only consulting about two services, the supply of electricity in embedded networks and OPSA, as Arlie's just covered. So if it's not one of those two, we're not currently consulting on it, but we may in the future look to bring other services under the AES framework. And EV chargers is a really good one. We know that we currently have a license exemption that applies for EV chargers. That exemption is due to expire, and we wouldn't have the AES framework as an option by that expiry point. So we'll probably look to extend that exemption for a while. But it may be that we then look at, is the AES framework a better option for regulating EV chargers, for instance. But it's a flexible framework. Over the coming years, as and when we identify a service that we think needs better customer protections, we can look at it with this framework in mind. So the next question is from George, who asks, can you please elaborate on what potential obligations are there with regard to life support for OPSA customers? Arlie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so currently it's the life support equipment obligations are around having regard for the customer, having a need for this equipment for OPSA. So it's really about if anything happens with the OPSA system and and needs to be disconnected or reconnected or serviced or maintained, it's about notifying the customer that this is going to happen. At the moment, the obligation is designed in mind with grid supply is still there as a backup, but we also do know that some life support customers use solar power as their backup from the main grid supply. So the obligation currently tries to strike this balance between, okay, if the OPSA system needs to be maintained and therefore it needs to be disconnected, and notify the customer ahead of time, make sure that the customer has all the information and can make other arrangements, but also does this disconnection require the customer also be disconnected from the grid? So sometimes the wiring can require for everything to be shut down for a period of time. And again, it's this having a regard to. So you need to note down, the OPSA provider needs to note down that there is a customer at that property that requires life support equipment. And then when it comes to having to disconnect the system, just making sure that the customer is notified, has enough notice prior to the disconnection. Again, I'm really looking for feedback here to see whether that has struck the right balance. And case studies would be great. So if someone has come across this already and is trying to work through that, that would be really good to hear from as well.
Thanks, Arlie. So the next question is from Joshua, who asks, what was the usage for OPSA small use customers? I'm taking that to mean the threshold for what is a small use customer. So that's the same as for other kinds of uses of the term small use customer in the Electricity Industry Act. It's 160 megawatt hours per year. And so that's 160,000 units of electricity per year used by that customer. We've got Deanne has asked, what processes are proposed if providers don't meet obligations? Is there a deregistration proposed? Aurelie, do you want to have a chat about what happens if someone doesn't comply?
Oh, this is a really good question because it just showcases the AES registration framework and the flexibility of it. So currently for an exempt provider, say SPPA providers that are currently exempt from the licensing regime, the only real recourse if obligations aren't met is for the exemption to cease, and then there could be penalties for operating without an exemption. The AES registration framework provides a little bit of flexibility. So there's a lot of opportunity for the operator to work with the ERA. It's called enforceable undertakings. So it's working together to find a solution for an agreed period of time so that the operator can come up to spec or can start meeting the obligations. The AES registration framework isn't designed to make it difficult to meet obligations. It's designed to make sure customers have access to customer protections and to make sure that we help operators provide those protections. I hope that I've answered that question. Feel free to ask a follow-up if I haven't covered it. But yeah, the idea is that there's enforceable undertakings. So there's an opportunity for the provider and the ERA, the regulator, to work together and try to meet the obligations over an agreed period of time.
There'll be a whole toolkit of options the ERA can take depending on how much of a non-compliance it is and how long it's been going on for and stuff like that. But the idea is that this is a new framework. There's an expectation that we'd be sort of educating people, particularly in the early years. We're not going to be able to reach absolutely everyone who needs to register. So it'll be about educating people as we go. And then as people know they need to be registered, if they're still continually not registering or not complying with conditions of registration, then the ERA can pursue some enforcement actions. So Sandeep has asked, will the technical requirements for OPS systems be detailed to ensure the OPSA platform to operate, including metering, telemetry, equipment integration and protection within the electrical installation? So this framework that we're talking about today, the AES framework, or the other options if we don't go down the AES framework, what we're talking about is really customer protections. So the only kind of overlap with some of the things you've mentioned there is metering. And the only sort of metering requirement that we have is about ensuring that the right data is being captured and then reflected on bills so that customers have an idea of what they're being billed for and can match that to kind of the information that they get from their retailer. So all those things that you've mentioned, this won't affect. They will continue to be in the instruments they're currently in. They'll continue to evolve through other processes that this office is doing. For those of you who've noticed that the Distributed Energy Resources Bill went through Parliament last week, that creates a whole new way of regulating some of those matters. And so there will be evolution in that space, but it sits alongside and complementary to this, but this is not the mechanism by which those things will change. I hope that answers your question, Sandeep. Neil has said, OPSA will only apply for smallest customers below 160 megawatt hours connected to a grid. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. Yes, that's correct in terms of the detailed obligations that Aurelie's gone through. If you supply customers through an OPSA and all your customers are larger than 160 megawatt hours, there would still be a requirement to register, but most of the obligations simply don't apply. So it would be that you'd register with the ERA, but if you have no small use customers, then most of those kind of customer protections don't apply. There's no requirement to sign up to the Electricity Ombudsman Scheme. So it would really just be registration. And that's partly so that there's a clear picture of who's out there and who's operating. And if there are issues, we know who's out there. So hopefully that answers your question, Neil. Dathankar has asked, does this have any effect on the constraints of the amount of solar and batteries that can be connected to the Western Power and Horizon Power network? No, there's no immediate interaction between this and that. That's something that's dealt with through different processes. So I think that's all the questions we've got through for now, but I'll give it a little bit of time in case anyone is typing away and still has a question they want answered, because we still have plenty of time left. Or more questions if anyone has a burning question they want.
It looks as though we don't have more coming through, but we will, as Sarah said, just give it a moment because we don't want to miss any if you've got them there.
All right, well, it looks like we've got one more through. So Neil's asked, is it likely that AES will impose financial hurdles on code participation? So I suppose it depends what you mean by financial hurdles. The idea of AES is that it is as low cost and light-handed as we can sort of practically make it while still providing enforceable code protections, access to the Ombudsman. So there will be some regulatory burden associated with it because it is a form of regulation, but we're looking to try and make those fees and costs associated with it as low and as manageable as possible. And so if you have a read of the series document that Aurelie mentioned, we've got a bit of an estimate of what the kind of costs might be on a per customer per year basis that might flow from having the regulator and the Ombudsman providing their roles in this framework.
It's between $10 and $37 per customer per year, but it's dependent on a whole bunch of variables that are outlined in the paper.
Thanks, Aurelie.
And of course, we're interested in feedback and data and case studies, as Aurelie said, in and around that. Okay. If we have no more questions, sorry.
One more.
Just one. Every time I do that, another one pops up.
So Ken asked, what's the cost for customer and provider? So that that cost that Aurelie just mentioned, that is the expected kind of cost that would be charged to the provider through fees. That said, we recognise that in many cases, the costs are going to flow through and the customer is going to have to bear them. So, you know, you can't just sort of add costs and they disappear. We recognise that. It's one of the reasons we want to keep this as low cost framework as possible. That might be it.
Thank you. Okay, I'll see if I can prompt one more by saying there's no more. Okay, well, I actually do think we're there now. I've just seen a thumbs up on the screen. Look, thank you so much for your well-considered questions. Thanks so much for being online as well for the session. Hopefully you've got a sense of the balance we're trying to strike and the key objectives that we're looking to achieve here. The paper is worth a read. While it's, as Aurelie said, it goes into some pages. It's written in a relatively simple and well laid out way, and very much encourage you to engage with it. Very, very eager to receive views throughout this process. It's important for us in order to achieve our objective of getting the balance right. So hopefully what we're doing is putting good information in your hands so that you can do that and do that well, and together we can get good outcomes here. So thanks again. Thanks to the team for great work, and we look forward to engaging with you throughout the rest of this process. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.